After studying this module, you would be able to, firstly, learn about key concepts of the psychoanalytic approach to counseling. Secondly, understand the counseling process involved. Thirdly, examine the counseling techniques and procedures of the psychoanalytic paradigm. And lastly, evaluate the contributions, limitations, and criticisms of the psychoanalytic paradigm. Now it is time to turn our attention to the specific theories which currently dominate the field of counseling, the well-known schools of counseling or counseling approaches. This common usage of these two words reflects a subtle relationship between the parts and the whole. For, in fact, each counseling approach is built on an underlying theory, a view of the individual, and each has practitioners, partisans of the theory, who apply the theory in clinical settings and teach it to others. Hence the alternate term school. We shall, in these modules, present an overview of the psychoanalytic approach by examining first its origins and then its view of the individual, its underlying theory of personality, of behavior, of what makes the person what she or he is. These modules will explicate the way in which practitioners of this particular position look at the individual client in particular. Next, we will consider the role of the counselor and examine ways in which the client is expected to contribute to the counseling process. The counselor's job varies directly with the role of the client. We will also observe that in some schools of counseling, very little is required of the client except that he or she comes to session. But we also note how other approaches require the client to engage in some risk taking and early commitments to courses of action. The history of psychoanalysis begins with Sigmund Freud from the year 1856 to 1939. Freud had collaborated with his mentor Joseph Breuer to write the first psychoanalytic paper, Studies in Hysteria, in 1895. This paper was about the founding case of psychoanalysis, a client referred to as Anna O. Before Freud, the field of psychology was considered a speculative philosophy on one hand and an empirical study of psychophysiological processes on the other, and the study of the human mind was limited to religious and magical thought. With psychoanalysis, psychology took a definite first step in the direction of scientific thinking about human motivation. Freud established the foundation for today's counseling and psychotherapy. He succeeded in bringing our knowledge of personality, human development, and psychological symptoms into everyday knowledge. Many of Freud's concepts, including the unconscious, the ego, and defense mechanisms, have become so widely accepted that we sometimes forget they began with Freud. Freud's efforts required great courage. He disagreed radically with the thinking of his peers, withstood years of verbal and written attacks, and worked prodigiously to advance his ideas. Freud's contributions can be seen in all areas of psychological inquiry today. Transgenerational, biological, and evolutionary psychology all have their roots in Freud's original theory. Even though some of Freud's theory is no longer accepted, his legacy includes laying the groundwork for current theories of mental health.
The Freudian view of human nature is basically deterministic. According to Freud, our behavior is determined by irrational forces, unconscious motivations, and biological and instinctual drives, as these evolve through key psychosexual stages in the first 6 years of life. Instincts are central to Freudian approach. Although he originally used the term libido to refer to sexual energy, He later broadened it to include the energy of all the life instincts. These instincts serve the purpose of the survival of the individual and the human race. They are orientated towards growth, development, and creativity. Libido, then, should be understood as a source of motivation that encompasses sexual energy but goes beyond it. Freud includes all pleasurable acts in his concept of the life instincts. He sees the goal of much of life as gaining pleasure and avoiding pain. Freud also postulates death instincts, which account for the aggressive drive. At times, people manifest through their behavior an unconscious wish to die or to hunt themselves or others. Managing this aggressive drive is a major challenge to the human race. In Freud's view, both sexual and aggressive drives are powerful determinants of why people act as they do. According to the psychoanalytic view, the personality consists of three systems: the id, the ego, and the superego. These psychological structures often overlap and intertwine and are not discrete entities, although each has distinctive properties. The id is the biological component, the ego is the psychological component, the superego is the social component. They operate together as the internal forces and form our personalities. Using this theoretical structure can facilitate understanding of strengths and areas of difficulties in a personality. The id. The id is the original system of personality. At birth, a person is all id. The id is the primary source of psychic energy and the seat of the instincts. It lacks organization and is blind, demanding, and insistent. Ruled by the pleasure principle, which is aimed at reducing tension, avoiding pain, and gaining pleasure. The id is illogical, amoral, and driven to satisfy instinctual needs. The id never matures. It does not think but only wishes or acts. The id is largely unconscious. The ego. The ego, like the superego, becomes differentiated from the id as the child develops. Although energy from the id provides the power for both the ego and the superego. The ego is not present at birth, but evolves as the baby realizes its separateness from the mother. The ego is aware of both the pressures of the id and the constraints of the superego, and seeks to moderate both while still meeting their needs. The ego has been described as the mental agent of rational and self conscious selfhood. It is a mediator and organizer. Guided by the reality principle or reality testing, the ego has considerable power. It can affect changes in the environment, postpone or suppress instinctual demands, and encourage sound moral judgment and flexibility. Using logic, intelligence, objectivity, and awareness of external reality, a healthy ego considers, modifies, and integrates both internal reality and external pressures on a person, decides when and how the person should respond to those demands, and identifies wise choices and behaviors that promote self preservation. The superego. The superego can be thought of as the opposite of the id. It is the sort of the rigid conscience that internalizes the rules and the guidelines of a person's world. Messages from parents, teachers, and society, as well as racial, cultural, and rational traditions, are important contributors to the development of a person's superego. The moral code of the superego is perfectionist, diligently discriminating between good and bad, right and wrong. The formation of the superego allows self control to take the place of parental control. When people follow the idealistic dictates of their superego, they typically feel proud and righteous, but may sacrifice pleasure and gratification. On the other hand, when they ignore the superego, shame, guilt, and anxiety may result. The superego serves an essential function in curtailing the drives of the id, But like the id, the superego is too controlling and extreme in its directives. Development of personality. A significant contribution of the psychoanalytic model is delineation of the stages of psychosocial and psychosexual development from birth through adulthood. This provides the counselor with the conceptual tools for understanding key developmental tasks characteristic of the various stages of life. Understanding the psychoanalytic view of development is essential if a counselor is to work in depth with the clients. I have found that the most typical problems people bring to counseling are: first, the inability to trust oneself and others, the fear of loving and forming close relationships, and low self esteem; second, the inability to recognize and express feelings of hostility, anger, rage, and hate, the denial of one's own power as a person, and the lack of feelings of autonomy. Third, the inability to fully accept one's sexuality and sexual feelings, difficulty in accepting oneself as a man or woman, and fear of sexuality. According to the Freudian psychoanalytic view, these three areas of personal and social development, that is, love and trust, dealing with negative feelings, and developing a positive acceptance of sexuality, are all grounded in the first 6 years of life. This period is the foundation on which later personality development is built. The nature of a person's development during those early years is a major factor in determining the later emotional health of that person. The first year of life. Freud labeled this year of life as the oral stage. As the mouth and lips are sensitive erogenous zones, sucking produces erotic pleasure for the infant. A lack of enough food or love during this life stage may lead to greediness and acquisitiveness. Material things that children seek become substitutes for what they really want, namely food and love from the mother. Later, personality problems that stem from the oral stage are the development of a view of the world based on mistrust, fear of reaching out to others, rejection of affection, fear of loving and trusting, low self esteem, isolation and withdrawal, and an inability to form or maintain intense relationships. Erik Erikson built on Freud's stages of development. Erikson's linking of personal and social development to Freud's concept of psychosexual development increased the relevance and importance of Freud's work. According to Erikson, issues of dependency and trust are particularly important during the initial or oral stage. In Erikson's psychosocial view, infancy is characterized by a struggle between trust and mistrust. An infant's basic task is to develop a sense of trust in self, others, and the world. When love is absent, the result is a general sense of mistrust of others. Clearly, infants who feel accepted are in a more favorable position to successfully meet future developmental crises than are those who do not receive adequate nurturing. Infants' most significant interpersonal relations are with their primary caregiver, ordinarily their mother. If they realize that their mother will provide food regularly, then they begin to learn basic trust. If they consistently hear the pleasant, rhythmic voice of their mother, then they develop more basic trust. If they can rely on an exciting visual environment, then they solidify basic trust even more. In other words, if their pattern of accepting things corresponds with culture's way of giving things, then infants learn basic trust. In contrast, they learn basic mistrust if they find no correspondence between their oral sensory needs and their environment. Basic trust is ordinarily syntonic and basic mistrust dystonic. Nevertheless, infants must develop both attitudes. Too much trust makes them gullible and vulnerable to the vagaries of the world, whereas too little trust leads to frustration, anger, hostility, cynicism, or depression. Erikson believed that some ratio of trust and mistrust is critical to people's ability to adapt. Ages 1 to 3. The anal stage marks another step in development. The tasks to be mastered during this stage are learning independence, personal power, and autonomy, and learning how to recognize and deal with negative feelings. Beginning in the second year and extending into the third, children continually face parental demands, experience frustrations when they handle objects and explore their environment, and are expected to master control of their bowels. When toilet training begins during the second year, children have their first major experience with discipline. During the anal period of development, the child will surely experience so called negative feelings such as hostility, destructiveness, anger, rage, hatred, and so on. It is important that children learn that these are acceptable feelings. Many clients in counseling have not yet learned to accept their anger and hatred towards those they love because they were either directly or indirectly taught that these feelings were bad and that parental acceptance would be withheld if they expressed them, they repressed them. According to Erikson, early childhood is a time for developing autonomy. Children who do not master the task of gaining some measure of self control develop a sense of shame and doubt about their abilities. Parents who do too much for their children hamper their independence. Children who are encouraged to stay dependent will doubt their capacities for successfully dealing with the world. Ages 3 to 6. During the phallic stage, sexual activity becomes more intense, and the focus of attention is on genitals, the boy's penis, and the girl's clitoris. According to the orthodox Freudian view, the basic conflict of the phallic stage centers on the unconscious incestuous desires that children develop for parent of the opposite sex. Because these feelings are of such a threatening nature, they are typically repressed. Yet, they are powerful determinants of later sexual development and adjustment. Along with the wish to possess the parent of the opposite sex comes the unconscious wish of to do away with the competition and the parent of the same sex. According to Freudian theory, boys and girls both experience sexual longings and conflicts, which they repress. Boys crave the attention of their mother, feel antagonistic towards father, and develop fear that father will punish them for incestuous feelings towards mother. This is known as the Oedipus complex. Mother becomes the love object both in fantasy and behavior, and boys exhibit sexual longings for mother. Ages 6 to 12. With the passing of the turbulence and the combined stresses of the oral, anal, and phallic stages of psychosexual development, the individual can enjoy a period of relative rest. The major structures of personality are largely formed, as are the relationships between these subsystems. During this latency period, new interests replace infantile sexual impulses. The sexual drive is sublimated, to some extent, to activities in schools, hobbies, sports, and friendships with members of the same sex. Due to identification with the same sex during this time, children form groups or cliques. The oral, anal, and the phallic stages taken together are known as the pregenital period. A major characteristic of this period is a narcissistic orientation or an inward and self centered preoccupation. During the middle childhood years, there is a turning outward toward relationships with others. Children of this age have an interest in the things of the external world as well as of their internal world. This period prevails until the onset of puberty, ages 12 to 60 above. Young adults move into the genital stage unless they become fixated at an earlier period of psychosexual development. The old themes of the phallic stage are reviewed and recapitulated, and adolescents typically develop interest in the opposite sex, engage in some sexual experimentation, and begin to assume adult responsibilities. As they move out of adolescence and into the mature adulthood, they form intimate relationships, become free of parental influence, and develop to be interested in others. There is a trend away from narcissism and toward altruistic behavior and concern for others. Erikson's view of development continues where Freud left off. It accounts for forces influencing adolescent development and various phases of adulthood. According to Erikson, the major developmental conflicts of the adolescent years are related to the formation of personal identity. Adolescents struggle to define who they are, where they are going, and how to get there. If they fail to achieve a sense of identity, role confusion results. Adolescents have the task of integrating a system of values that will give their life a direction. On the formation of a personal philosophy of life, they must make key decisions relating to religious beliefs, sexual ethics, values, and so forth. In this search for identity, models are especially important. Erikson has delineated three stages that cover the adult period, that are young adulthood, middle age, and later life. First, young adulthood. In Erikson's view, we approach adulthood after we master the adolescent conflicts over identity and role confusion. During young adulthood, our sense of identity is tested again by the challenge of intimacy versus isolation. One key characteristic of the psychologically mature person is the ability to form intimate relationships. A prerequisite to establishing this intimacy with others is a confidence in our own identity. Intimacy involves an ability to share with others and to give to others from our own centeredness. Now, middle age. This is the time for learning how to live creatively with both ourselves and others. On one hand, we may painfully experience the discrepancy between our dreams of young adulthood and the reality of what we have accomplished. Erikson sees the stimulus for continued growth in middle age as the crisis between generativity and stagnation. He considers generativity in the broad sense to include creating through a career, family, leisure, time activities, and so on. The main quality of productive adults is their ability to love well, to work well, and to play well. If adults fail to achieve a sense of productivity, they begin to stagnate and to die psychologically. Now, later life. According to Erikson, the core crisis of the elderly is integrity versus despair. Ego integrity is achieved by those who feel few regrets. They have lived a productive and worthwhile life and have coped with their failures as well as their successes. They are not obsessed with what might have been, and they are able to derive satisfaction from what they have done. They are able to view death as a part of the life process, and they can still find meaning in how they are living now. The failure to achieve ego integrity tends to lead to feelings of despair, hopelessness, guilt, resentment, and self disgust. Counseling implications. By taking a combined psychosexual and psychosocial perspective, counselors have a useful conceptual framework for understanding developmental issues as they appear in counseling. Regardless of a counselor's theoretical preference, relevant questions such as these can give direction to the counseling process. And these are: first, what are some major developmental tasks at each stage in life? And how are these tasks related to counseling? Second, what are some of the themes that give continuity to this individual's life? Third, what are some universal concerns of people at various points in life? How can people be challenged to make life affirming choices at these points? Fourth, what is relationship between an individual's current problem and significant events from earlier years? Fifth, what influential factors have shaped one's life? Sixth, what choices were made at these critical periods and how did the person deal with these various crises? Repression is one of the most important Freudian process, and it is the basis of many other ego defenses and of neurotic disorders. It is a means of defense through which threatening or painful thoughts and feelings are excluded from awareness. Freud explained repression as an involuntary removal of something from consciousness. It is assumed that most of the painful events of the first 5 years of life are so excluded, yet these events do influence later behavior. Repression is also a routine process that continues even after 6 years of life. Denial. Denial plays a defensive role similar to that of repression, yet it generally operates at preconscious and conscious levels. Denial of reality is perhaps the simplest of all self defense mechanisms. It is a way of distorting what the individual thinks, feels, or perceives in a traumatic situation. It consists of defending against anxiety by closing one's eyes to the existence of threatening reality. In tragic events such as wars and other disasters, people often blind themselves to realities that would be too painful to accept. Reaction formation is one defense against a threatening impulse is to actively express the opposite impulse. By developing conscious attitudes and behaviors that are diametrically opposed to disturbing desires, people do not have to face the anxiety that would result if they were to recognize these dimensions of themselves. Individuals may conceal hate with a facade of love, be extremely nice when they harbor negative reactions, or mask cruelty with excessive kindness. Projection. Another mechanism of self deception consists of attributing to others own self unacceptable desires and impulses. Lustful, aggressive, or other impulsive are seen as being possessed by those people out there, but not by me. For example, a man who is sexually attracted to his daughter may maintain that it is she who is behaving seductively with him. Thus, he does not have to recognize or deal with his own desires. Displacement. One way to cope with anxiety is to discharge impulses by shifting from a threatening object to a safer target. Displacement consists of directing energy towards another object or person when the original object or person is inaccessible. For example, the meek man who feels intimidated by his boss comes home and unloads inappropriate hostility onto his children. Rationalization. Some people manufacture good reasons to explain away a bruised ego. Rationalization helps justify specific behaviors and it aids in softening the blow connected with disappointments. When people do not get positions they have applied for in their work, they think of logical reasons they did not succeed, and they sometimes attempt to convince themselves that they really did not want the position anyway. Sublimation. From the Freudian perspective, many of the great artistic contributions resulted from a redirection of sexual or aggressive energy into creative behaviors. Sublimation involves diverting sexual or aggressive energy into another channels, ones that are usually socially acceptable and sometimes even admirable. For example, aggressive impulses can be channeled into athletic activities so that the person finds a way of expressing aggressive feelings and, as an added bonus, is often praised. Regression. Some people revert to a form of behavior they have outgrown. In this regression to an earlier phase of development, the demands are not so great. In the face of severe stress or extreme challenge, individuals may attempt to cope with their anxiety by clinging to immature and inappropriate behaviors. For example, children who are frightened in school may indulge in infantile behavior such as weeping, excessive dependence, thumb sucking, hitting, or clinging to the teacher. They are seeking to return to a time in their life when there was security. Introjection. Introjection consists of taking in and swallowing the values and standards of others. For example, is the child abused who assumes the abusing parent's way of handling stresses and thus continues the cycle of child beating. There are also positive forms of introjections, such as the incorporation of parental values or the attributes and values of the counselor. Identification. Although identification is a part of the developmental process by which children learn sex role behaviors, it can also be a defensive reaction. It can enhance self worth and protect one from a sense of being a failure. Thus, people who feel basically inferior may identify themselves with successful causes, organizations, or people in the hope that they will be perceived as worthwhile. Compensation consists of masking perceived weaknesses or developing certain positive traits to make up for limitations. Thus, children who do not receive positive attention and recognition may develop behaviors designed to at least get negative attention. This mechanism have direct adjustive value, and it can also be an attempt by the person to say, don't see the ways in which I am inferior, but see me in my accomplishments.
The summary of this module is as follows. This module reviewed the psychoanalytic theory as developed by Sigmund Freud. It also provided information about Freud's background. Please refer to the Learn More quadrant of this module and on the development of his concepts, which form the foundation for modern conceptions of psychological development, mental health, and the treatment of mental disorders. Post-Freudian, Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development were described. Freud's theory emphasizes the 3 structures of personality, which are the id, ego, and superego, the 5 stages of psychosexual development of humans, which are oral, anal, phallic, latency and genital stages, defense mechanisms and levels of consciousness, which are unconscious, preconscious, and conscious. This conceptual framework has implications for the counseling process. Developmental tasks of each stage of human development, themes that give continuity to an individual's life, universal concerns at various points in life, making life affirming choices at these points, influential factors, especially from earlier years, that have shaped one's life and helped in dealing with crisis.